Today is to look at the factors that African countries should consider when they're comparing large reactors with SMRs and making a selection of whether we should go for large or small reactors. We've got a very good panel here, and so we've got Dr. Lesedi Nuclear, who's the chairman of the Rwanda Energy Board. If you could come and join us, please. Anyway, we've got Dr. Stephen Yamua from, he's the Executive Director for Nuclear Power in Ghana. Stephen, if you could please join us. Good morning. And then we've got Awal Bisala. He's the Deputy Director, Head International Cooperation and Liaison, Nigerian Atomic Energy Commission.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, good to see you. Okay, so I'm going to make some introductory statements, and then I'm going to ask each one of them to say a little bit about themselves and their role that they're currently fulfilling. And then I'll put some questions to the panel, and I'm sure there'll be some very interesting comments coming out. So in general, you know, as I said, we'll talk about the factors that countries should consider when they look at large versus small reactors in Africa. We know Africa is a growing continent with a growing demand for energy, but there's limited access to reliable electricity. And South Africa is a prime example of that these days. There's a state of disaster that has been introduced by the government because of the rolling blackouts and the problems with electricity supply in South Africa at the moment. But nuclear power is a promising option to meet the demand in Africa for electricity. And so when one starts to look at large versus small, the first obvious thing is the upfront cost of large reactors. The upfront cost is very big, but you get much more electricity, and in the long run, it becomes cheap, the electricity. For example, Koeberg Nuclear Power Station is 40 South African cents per unit. It's the cheapest on the entire Eskom grid, cheaper than renewables, cheaper than coal. So in the long term, a large nuclear power station is a very good asset to have in your energy mix. Smaller reactors, of course, lower upfront cost, more accessible to smaller economies, countries with smaller economies. Secondly, infrastructure. Large reactors require large infrastructures, large sites, cooling intake basins, cooling systems, and so on, whereas a small reactor can be operated with fewer resources, and it's ideal for remote locations. Thirdly, safety and security. Large reactors have many complex safety systems, whether they're passive or active. This requires a large maintenance staff to make sure the plants are operated safely. Small reactors are inherently safe, simpler design, walk-away safe, some, as we heard yesterday from NuScale. In these days, there's a new context, and that is the risk of attacks on these plants. Larger plants are more vulnerable, smaller plants may be less vulnerable. Some of them are underground and so on. So in areas where there's instability, maybe the small ones are safer to go for. And then lastly, the regulatory environment. For large PWR or other reactors, you need a very robust regulatory environment. Small reactors have the promise of avoiding some of those very stringent regulations. You know, you may not need to have ASME3 for a Copenhagen Atomics SMR, and so on and so forth. So both have advantages and disadvantages. And so now I'll ask the panel to get into a little bit more detail in this discussion. Dr. Zerbo.
Thank you, Derick. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this panel. And then I want to thank Zaf and Ibrahim for organizing this setting for African to talk about nuclear energy and the difficulty and challenges that we have in our continent. But anyway, who am I? I'm Lesedi Zerbo, chairman of the board of directors of the Rwanda Atomic Energy Board. I'm here with Fidel, who is the CEO. So I have a background, I'm a geophysicist by training, work in mining, in industry, joined the United Nations system as executive secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Went into flirting a little bit with politics, not flirting, but I was in government. And then I'm now focusing on Africa, on responses to Africa challenges. And then nuclear energy is one of them. So that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Derick, and good morning to you all. So I'm Stephen Yamwa, the Executive Director, Nuclear Power Ghana. Nuclear Power Ghana is one of the institutions that the Ghana government has established following through the IEA milestone as the proposed or future owner-operator organization. And I lead this organization. We are currently working on phase 2 of our nuclear power program. Before I took over as the Executive Director, Nuclear Power Ghana, I was the Deputy Director, Nuclear Power Institute of Ghana Atomic Energy Commission, and we worked on the various activities for the phase 1 nuclear program. My background is mechanical engineering, and then also later on did my master's and PhD in nuclear engineering. And aside the nuclear infrastructure development, I also teach at a graduate school of nuclear and allied sciences, which is jointly established by Ghana Atomic Energy Commission and University of Ghana as an institution to train nuclear professionals for various aspects of nuclear applications in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derick, and thank you very much, a Nuclear Business Platform, for this opportunity to be part of this very important dignitaries on this panel. My name is Awal Bisalla, and I work with the Nigeria Atomic Energy Commission, where I function as a Deputy Director in charge of international cooperation and partnerships. Essentially what I do in the Nigeria Atomic Energy Commission is to coordinate the bilateral and multilateral relations that Nigeria has with other countries and developing partners specifically focused on the nuclear science and technology applications in the country. I've equally been saddled with the responsibility of coordinating the activities of the National Liaison Office for IAEA coordination in Nigeria. At the same time, I superintend over the activities of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, which is also directly under my role and jurisdiction, including the Nigerian National Data Center for the CTBTO. I've equally been part of the implementation of Nigeria's integrated work plan with the IAEA on nuclear power plant infrastructure development. So essentially, that's my role at the moment. Thank you very much.
A very strong panel here to discuss the topic of small versus large reactors in Africa, and I'm looking forward to the insights that we could get. So I'm going to put 1 or 2 questions to each of you, and starting over there with Dr. Zerbo. Got to get my glasses on. In your opinion, what should be the consideration factors for choosing between large and small reactors?
Derick, I think you've mentioned it in your introductory remarks already. You talk about financial, political, and then the infrastructure challenges that Africa will have in terms of large-scale nuclear power plants. I think if you take what the IEA has recommended, that the plan, nuclear power plant that a country might be willing to have should be that it's first of all, its grid size should be 10 times that nuclear power plant, and that Africa has difficulty increasing its grid already because of the known challenges, infrastructural challenges and political commitment, and the fact that countries are not, in Africa, we tend to be centralized in big cities. And then when you go to rural areas, so there is very little electricity grid that people can use. So if you take that into consideration, we have a big challenge, not only financial, because we have other priorities. And then we tend to forget that the priority should be linked to the energy itself. So because without energy, there is no development. And we went into, if you look at what's happening, especially in West Africa, where hydropower, except Ghana and some of the countries, is very difficult to implement. If I take a country like Burkina Faso or Mali, we're focusing on solar energy right now, and that's what the Western country have pushed the Sahel region to work on. But solar energy and solar power, it's only giving electricity to families, and it doesn't help for industrial development. And then when you look at the large scale, government tend to be hesitant with regard to nuclear power because they say, you know, it's too big, too expensive, security and safety reason, with the discipline that is required for that, it's quite challenging. And then come this innovative technology around the SMR, the small modular reactors, and the nano or micro modular reactor that the recent development are bringing to place. So when you see that, I think in terms of being attractive, that's the first thing that people see. It's small, and then it can be moved. There's a flexibility around it. And then it's likely to be cheaper than what is known in terms of infrastructure required for its implementation. So I've been involved with several startups on the implementation of small modular reactors. And then when you talk about it in the African context, government tend to be more leaning towards the small modular reactor than the large scale that they've seen as risk for the country, and then sometimes making confusion between civil nuclear application and then the military application, or in fact some of the concern that they've had with the accident that we've known so far in Chernobyl and Fukushima. So I think those are the big challenges that people see in Africa, and then tend, in developing countries, you know, as a whole, and then tend to be a bit hesitant with regard to large scale and be focusing on smaller scale. And then the micro reactors seem to be quite attractive, because if you take some of the startup in the US trying to bring a nuclear reactor into a 4-foot container, I mean, that's something that it's quite attractive for countries, meaning you can just bring it and then plug into your grid to a community of, in remote places and villages. I think that's something, I mean, that's certainly the solution that we should embark in, because it will be easier for us, easy to implement, flexible in its implementation. So that's what I wanted to add as first stand on why large, why small instead of large. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Zerbo. Welcome, Dr. Kisolo. I wonder, I'll come back to you now. I just want to ask Dr. Zerbo his second question, and then I'll ask you to give a short introduction of yourself. The last point you made ties nicely in with the next question I have for you. So, for large reactors, there are the big five possible suppliers. For small SMRs, we're talking about 70, 80 different concepts of projects going on, different technologies, either scaled down PWRs or scaled up submarine reactors or molten salt reactors and everything you can imagine, high temperature gas, and it's a very complex situation, and to try and make any sense of it and decide, and all of them are at different stages of development and so on and so forth. So my question relates to that, and it's how can Africa coordinate the different countries between themselves to come to a sensible approach to adopting SMRs or larger reactors?
I would say the $500,000 question. I won't say $1 million question. It's a $500,000 question that we have in Africa. You see, we have, in the context of the Africa Union, we have the Africa Commission on Nuclear Energy. But for a long period of time, it hasn't fulfilled its role as it should be with regard to promoting nuclear energy for Africa. And yet, that was one of the main objectives of the African Commission. So what happened, countries have gone into developing or trying to implement a nuclear energy or nuclear power plant on their own. And we should have taken the example of a country like Ghana, because historically, since the Nkrumah's time in the late 50s, he had a vision for the continent in terms of energy. And then they set up the Ghana Atomic Energy Commission, which I personally think, I could be wrong, that should have been a model in terms of the vision that the president had to take and promote and implement nuclear energy in Africa. So I think it's from that the Africa Commission on Nuclear Energy was set up within the Africa Union. Now, has it been working? I would say no. And then I'm allowing myself to say this. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And that work needs the support of the vendors that many are in this room, the government, the political commitment that we need. But in terms of the political commitment as well, we have to find the right people at the right place, and then with the right network to be able to push this endeavor. Yesterday I was in a discussion with someone, and then I was telling him, look, what if the Rwanda Atomic Energy Commission had come and then asked Uganda to share its feasibility study, as an example? What would you say? I bet many of us in the African continent will say, no, this is my feasibility study, and then this is yours, and then we'll be reinventing the wheel all the time. Rwanda will have its own feasibility study, Uganda will have its own, Ghana will have its own, Nigeria, and then so forth. We can't develop nuclear energy in that context within Africa. There is a need for coordination, there is a need for capacity building across the borders for African to be able to project themselves in the future that represent nuclear energy for the continent, and then fulfill the challenges that we have. And then I think it's a responsibility of the vendors as well. I think one thing is to come to the continent and then go to one country and then say, this is what I can do for you, and then be attractive in giving them a little bit of money to say, I will sponsor this for you, I will sign an MOU, I will sign a contract, I will do this, I will do that. But I think the vendors also should come with an idea of how this could be coordinated within Africa in taking West, Central, East, and South, and then see whether we go for large scale or we go for SMR, and then that could be the solution as well on the choice that region or country could make.
My name is Felix Solo. I'm the chairperson of the Atomic Energy Council. Atomic Energy Council in Uganda is the national regulatory authority. We have two organs. One, the policy organ, which is the council or board, consisting of 5 members, including the chair, and the secretariat, which is headed by the executive, the secretary, who is the CEO. And our council over this short period of time has grown, and we now have about 60 full-time employees at the Secretariat, divided more or less 50-50, but slightly more of technical people. So we have been building capacity. Of course, we started from literally nothing, and now we are preparing also ourselves for new assignments, like regulating the nuclear power program. You also heard yesterday, we are also going to, and have started, also planning regulating the nuclear research reactor. We also have now many modern applications of ionizing radiation in medicine and water, and we are doing a good job. We've also had a stint at university where I was in nuclear and radiation physics. We've also been a counterpart of many national projects and also a participant in IA programs like Train the Trainer. Thank you.
Thank you very much and welcome. We move now to Dr. Stephen Yambua, and again, I've got two questions for you. In your view, what is the current status of engagement of the SMR developers in Africa?
Thank you very much. I would say without a doubt there's been an improved engagement looking at the past few years up to now. This probably is as a result of the potential clients expressing interest in SMR technology. That's number one. And two, also the advancement in the technology development from the vendors. I remember in our own case as Ghana, when we started our nuclear program, the focus was more on large reactor because at the time there wasn't much, progress in the SMR landscape. So with the advancement in the, some of the technologies, it has become more relevant for African countries, mostly with very small grade, expressing interest in the SMR technology. This has also been improved also through, national and international bodies, also providing a platform for engagement between vendors and, countries that are, expressing interest in nuclear power. For example, the International Atomic Energy Agency SMR platform. Nuclear Energy Agency has also, been promoting SMR development. Reuters events in recent years, they've also been, engaging, bringing vendors and countries that are interested in nuclear power together to share experience for the countries to learn what is happening in the SMR landscape. So all of this has contributed to an improved engagement, enhanced engagement between African countries and SMR developers. Of course, not only African countries. Globally too, there's been a lot of interest in SMR development. However, I think there is still more room to engage. The question is, at what point does vendors engage potential clients? Some of the technologies have moved from a concept, from theoretical, thought to a realistic, ready to be constructed technology. But of course, this is a choice of the various countries and then the other parameters that comes into play. In short, I would say that there's been a lot of engagement in recent years, but there's still more room to engage, to expand the potential benefits of SMRs, and also to bring that into context, the realities as it exists on the African continent.
Thank you very much. And you touched on something that leads on to the next question. You said that when you first started looking at SMRs and so on, the technology was still very immature, and so that comes to the question: what about the fears of adopting a first-of-a-kind type of SMR in an African context?
That's a real good question. And I will tackle it from the concept of, what you find, for example, in IEA documentation as proven technology. And proven technology, explained to be a situation where certain components or a nuclear power plant design, have gone through certain years of operational experience. And so when you juxtapose that to XMR, and unfortunately, in the context of proven technology, there's more focus on the power plant having been constructed and in operation. And so when you put it in that context, and with the words proving technology, and knowing that, no SMR, of course, I think with the exception of the Russian floating reactor, is in operation, then the opposite then becomes a case. That is, means the SMRs are unproven, and that is the source of the fear. However, as I also said, the provenness of the technology is not just about the power plant constructed and in operation, but before that stage, various systems, various components go through different tests and approvals. And therefore, when the systems and the components have gone through such approvals, then in one way or the other, it sort of also reduces, if it doesn't eliminate, the fear of first of a kind. But typically, in the context of Africa, to get to that stage of construction readiness, unfortunately, the regulatory bodies in Africa are also new, just as the future operators. And therefore, it is very difficult, if not impossible, for the regulatory bodies to be in a position to license the design. In other words, the approvals of the systems and components before it becomes complete for construction. And therefore, one way that I think this fear of first of a kind can be reduced or eliminated is when the technology developers have taken their technology through regulatory approvals from their own regulatory body. And this is important and significant because these regulatory bodies have been regulating large reactors and have been successful in regulating large reactors. They are experienced and have the technological know-how and the systems to go through such regulatory approvals. And therefore, if a technology is able to go through the developer's own regulator's approval, that alone is, the starting point, in my view, should be the minimum criteria for African countries opting for SMR technology. I'll give you an example. When Ghana issued a request for information in 2001, we received a whole lot of responses, including SMRs. There were some that had not been, taken through regulatory approvals. There was a particular instance where they indicated that as at the time they were submitting their response, they have also submitted their documentation for approval to their regulatory body. Few months after that, the approval was denied. So the point I'm making is that, yes, in the context of proving technology, we cannot, of course, it's a matter of choice and, the level of risks that each of these countries are prepared to take. However, I think the minimum level of, accepting this technology should be when the technology has been taken through design approval stages at the country of origin. And that alone for me is enough grounds for consideration as a first of a kind technology. The other side of it is also about cost and also about schedule, of course, because it has not been done, even though there are indications of shorter construction period, reduced upfront cost, but of course, every first of a kind has some uncertainties, and the level of uncertainties that a country is prepared to take is also dependent on how much risks that country is also willing to take. So yes, there is this anxiety, fear of first of a kind, but in the context of when the technology has been approved, there's the design and ready to be constructed, waiting for client, I think that should be enough to reduce the supposed fear of first of a kind.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. I think that the other issue that plays along with this is if you look at the choice made by OPG in Canada for the scaled-down BWR is the supply chain. The supply chain already exists for that, for most of the components in that reactor. It's proven technology, and that was one of the key decision-making factors for OPG in Canada. So let's move to Engineer Bisala. And do you think that the SMR developers are overlooking Africa? And then the second question is there a lack of engagement? Or?
Thank you very much, Derick. Well, there's a huge electricity deficit in Africa, which makes Africa potentially a huge market for new energy sources, particularly energy from nuclear. Over the years, just like the last panelist mentioned, what was understood was the traditional nuclear power plants as against the small modular reactors. But with the advent of the evolution of the small modular reactors, even though they are considered first of a kind, we still see the small modular reactor technology as a game changer in the entire nuclear space, particularly by us coming from the African region. Essentially, it's important for us to have engagements, but unfortunately, it's not enough what we are seeing, particularly coming from the developers of small modular reactors. Yes, as I've mentioned earlier, the huge cost of the traditional nuclear power plants has made it practically impossible and has been an impediment for most African countries to venture into generating electricity from nuclear. That is apart from other concerns like safety, security, and others. But that huge cost has made it very difficult for most African countries to go into nuclear. But as I've said, with the advent of the small modular reactors, people are seeing light at the end of the tunnel, seeing possibility of considering small modular reactors as options. But it comes with different parameters, configurations, specifications as compared with the traditional nuclear power plants. So you need an entirely new regulation, entirely new capacity development, and a lot of other things will be needed to support the introduction of small modular reactors. So you cannot take in, as an African, you cannot take in a technology that you do not understand. So, and that is why engagement right from the conceptualization is important. We need to create that interface because it is not enough, as I've said. Yes, IAEA is doing a lot. They have even developed, they have published a booklet which is Advanced Small Modular Reactor Development. And they have revised this booklet over time, giving specific configurations of the various small modular reactors that have been developed. And I think that's a guide for most of us from Africa. Again, IAEA has established an interregional project to support member states in terms of capacity development, in terms of understanding the technology, and even the regulatory requirements. This project has been deployed. In fact, my country is also participating in this project. It has opened up some opportunity for us to understand what the small modular reactors are, what they can actually provide, and it has also helped us in a way to begin to talk about what kind of regulations will be needed. But the real engagement should come from the developers. Unfortunately, very few developers have reached out to most African countries, despite the interest and the huge market that the small modular reactors will have eventually in Africa, because interest generally in generating electricity from nuclear, at least introducing it to the energy mix of the continent. So that's where I'll now mention the issue of African Commission on Nuclear Energy. This is a platform that can be used to engage Africa more. There are two components to the engagements. One component is technical. You need to engage more with the technical people. Another component is political. Political in the sense that you need to get the commitment of leadership of various governments at the highest level. It's one thing for you as a technical person to understand a technology. It's also another thing for the leadership, the political leaders, the legislators to really understand and accept a particular technology. So using a platform like the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, I'm sure it will help for us to have a system within Africa speaking to another system within the same continent. The language will be understood better if such platforms are used, essentially. So I think we need greater engagement and greater involvement, which is still not very adequate. And we can achieve more using platforms of this nature, this kind of conference where you meet developers, you discuss with them, understand the inherent safety features and other features that are associated with the development of small modular reactors. That will help you in taking an informed decision as a nation, because it's not only you need to also discuss back home with several other professionals, at least, so that we understand exactly where we are heading. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a good summary, and it's key that the IAEA is playing such an important role in Africa. Dr. Kisolo, we've got a few minutes left, and I'm looking forward to your response. it relates to, do you think that the larger reactors would be more economical in the African context? And what are the grid implications of having larger reactors? I know that Uganda, when you looked at your feasibility studies in about 2015, there was the first of a kind fears, and you decided on 2 large 1,000 megawatts units as a target for the plan for Uganda. So if you could comment on those 2 points, and then we will wrap up the discussion.
Right. Thank you. That is a good question. And for Uganda, we are aware of the benefits of the small modular reactors, like my first panelist has just discussed, and they do fit quite well with our kind of situation. However, as a country, we believe we at the moment need to go for a large nuclear reactor. The major reason why we need to go for a big nuclear reactor is mainly meeting the immediate national goals. The national goals at the moment is to get sufficient power to improve the economy of the country. The economy of the country is dependent now on getting good infrastructure in place. You have heard of the standard gauge rail. So we want sufficient power which can help us in meeting that kind of demand. Also in the country, we want to do industrialization. We are having many things we produce, right from agricultural produce to minerals and textiles and what have you. So we want power which can help us in this effort of industrializing the country. Presently, government has started a policy of setting up industrial parks in major cities throughout the country. And all these places really need a lot of power, reliable and stable power, to do that industrialization. So we want to go for big reactor primarily because there is big demand for power for modernization of our economy. Then when we talk of fear of the first kind, of course, like many member states in Africa, we have really been collaborating with IAEA in all these areas, and with the help of IAEA and partner friends, we have been able to really weigh through what we have to do, really to get big power to the end point where we want it. Things like energy planning, where we plan our energy and how best we can do. Things like grid development and maintenance and dealing with those kind of issues about nuclear power distribution. So we feel for the time being, we shall start with technology one, which is established. Okay? Technology which has been on the market, easy to run, easy to maintain, and with partners who are willing to work with us. Of course, we're also doing another important area of human resource, building capacity again through partnerships with vendors and guidance with IAEA. I believe we should be able to cope with the first of its kind successfully.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the members of the panel. I think those were some very insightful comments that were made. I've noted just 5 key points. I think one of the key points here is that there needs to be more cooperation between the African countries and sharing feasibility studies and and information. The other point that was being made around first of a kind is that if a technology is licensed in the country of origin or design approval in the country of origin, that would reduce the fear around the first of a kind issue. SMRs are potentially game changers for Africa, for remote locations where grids are not as large and interconnected. Also note that the IAEA continues to play a key role in developing nuclear power in Africa, which is really good. And then for Uganda, the national interest of growing the economy and industrialization is one of the drivers for getting sufficient electricity, and therefore their drive for large nuclear reactors. I don't know if we have time for a question or two. One question from the audience.
It's a great learning experience, I think, for everybody here. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Kisolo, I had a question for you, and you mentioned that industrialization is a big driver for Uganda, and that your initial plan and thought is to deploy large-scale reactors rather than SMRs in the first venture. And I wondered if that is driven by a need for specific megawatts, and you might consider or at least evaluate a small modular reactor that could get you close to what a large reactor might do in that first deployment.
Yeah, thank you very much for that good question. Really, we are thinking of a power reactor in the range of 1,000 megawatts. Mm-hmm. So this should be able to start us off as we actually are developing. The main goal at the moment is to go to about 2,000 megawatts of nuclear power. So at least, as you have now heard, we hope that by 2031, maybe the first 1,000 should be able to get online as we develop the other one. Now, timelines and the planning, well, we believe, like we know the small modular, that we can assemble to that power with time. But I think that opportunity will come. That opportunity will come. We want to start with this, as we have already said. The big ones also mean a lot of investment, initial investment. But Uganda, at least as a country, we have the government commitment. So I think with partners and financing modalities, we should be able to maybe accomplish that. Thank you.